Morning everyone, welcome to the studio. I'm Lindy Whitten, if you don't already know me, and today I'm going to be doing a small acrylic painting on a little prepared gesso panel, and it's going to be of a river with some rocks, some submerged, some not. I've been doing a very large acrylic painting here of submerged rocks, and it's inspired me, along with my Patreon group members, requests to do some work on rivers and rocks and submerged rocks and how we get those effects. So that's what our small acrylic lesson will be today. I hope you enjoy it, and let's get on with it. Here's our setup. I have a small canvas here, some water, brushes. I also have a bunch of palette knives if I need them. Over in the corner, which you'll probably get out of view once I start painting, is a little square sponge that's been wet, and that's what I like to wipe my palette knives on. It makes them clean very easily. On my palette I have set up the colours that I'll be using, and I'll add in some pastel colours perhaps at some point, but at the moment what I have over in this section are my earth colours. So I've got raw umber, I've got raw sienna dark, yellow ochre, a sienna, and a transparent red oxide, which gives a really nice red glow. Over here I have the yellows, a cad yellow light, cad yellow medium, orange, dark sea purple, ultramarine blue in the corner, that's where it always goes, always know where it is, and up here is a cerulean blue, which is for the sky and the reflections in the water. And up here is a Mars black, so that's a brownish black, which I may or may not use, and when I do use it I just usually add a little bit to something else. I'm going to change a few things in this photo. It's already cropped down from my original photo. What I want to do is to use that S-curve of the river to lead us through the painting. It's a very elongated painting. It's just a little slice of the river there. I want to show you the techniques for getting the submerged rocks and pebbles here, the rocks that are above water, dry pebbles around here, and then the foliage in the sky and reflections, which all help to form this shape through here. If we didn't have the reflections, it would not be such an interesting composition, but having the reflections helps us as we lead our eye through the painting. Let's start with tinting the paper. I'm going to use just a wide flat brush, dip it in a bit of water, and I'm going to tint the whole paper with this red oxide because there's a lot of green in it and it will help with that. So just a bit of water, make up a nice loose mixture and brush it across. I'm not really worried about how I brush it either. I'm just wanting to cover the whole canvas nice and quickly and just keep adding in that. And I don't mind if it's a little bit more red here. In fact, when I get to this spot which is going to be all the trees, I think I'm going to actually add in a little bit of orange, just for a little bit of extra kick there. And because there are wild Monbretias, this is a scene in New Zealand, and wild Monbretias all grow a lot through here, which are very bright orange. I used to have some in the garden, and when the children were younger and had guinea pigs, I loved watching the way the guinea pigs just hoovered up those leaves. It was very amusing. So here I'm going, just keeping on with the red. What it's also doing is helping to form this very warm colour that is the riverbed. All the way down. Just to cover the white of the paper and give me a nice warm underglow when I start painting. I'll also be doing around the edges there, because I always paint around the edges on canvases. I'm just going to wait for it to dry. While it dries, I'll just talk about this light moulding paste. It's an opaque, lightweight texture medium for acrylics. This one's from Golden, but you can get other brands as well. It's sort of a light, fluffy kind of paste, and it's really useful for adding a little bit of texture. It's very lightweight, so you can use it on small canvases without adding to the weight of them, or you can use it on paper. So we'll be doing some of that in a moment once this dries. So just going back in with the texture paste. I'm sorry if you missed a bit of that. For some reason my video turned off. I just put the texture paste on where I want to have a little bit of extra texture, dabbing it with my palette knife so it goes into little ridges and peaks, and create a little bit of extra interest and texture on the canvas there. And you could do this by using very thick paint and using sort of an impasto effect there, but this is a very quick and easy way to do it, so I just use it sometimes, not all the time, but it's nice to have a little play with different ways of achieving things. Again, it's the light moulding paste by Golden, but you can use, oh, there are lots of different ones. You could just use a heavy matte gel to do the same kind of thing. The heavy matte gels dry dry clear, so that's something to consider as well if you're looking for a clear gel. And this one dries white, opaque. So here I've got these larger rocks, and what I'm just doing is doing a much flatter kind of stroking on, but what it does is give me a little bit of a raised effect from the water, which I'm going for. So you can make hard edges with this, put in the general shape, and it will give you a little bit of texture where you're pulling with your knife, which will create some nice patterns. I'm going to go for these 1, 2, 3 rocks here to give sort of a lead into the river. I'm keeping their general shape, but not getting too caught up on having to have the exact shape. What I want is these leading edges here, here and here to be pointing the direction into the river, and I'm careful when I'm putting this on to not create equilateral triangles. We don't like that. We want to have, you know, if your rock's in a triangular shape, have one side shorter, the other side longer. It's more pleasing visually. Here it's a steeper sort of triangular shape. So they're all pointing into the river there. I can go ahead now and do a little bit of patting here for the general little pebbles. If I put too much on, I just scrape it off again. Pat, pat, pat to create some little raised gravelly effects there. And I'm not going to do all the little rocks, but you can do as many as you like with just a little dab of the texture paste with your palette knife. Now it's another drying time. What I'm going to do now is start with the sky, lay in the sky, then wash in the riverbed, then put in some of those individual stones and a suggestion of those stones. I'm going to start with a fairly big brush, big flat brush, a little dip of water, and here's some cerulean blue. You know what? I'm just going to turn that around so that my yellows are near my yellows and my blues are near my blues. So I've got some blue there. I'm going to mix it with a little bit of this tinting white, which is a pearl titanium kind of white. And then I'll just try it out. Too dark. Let's go in with a little bit more. Quite a lot more, in fact. Giving it a good mix up on here with the brush. You could use the palette knife for mixing, which I often do. So it comes out darker than you think because of the underpainting there. So that's a little bit darker than I want. So what I'm actually going to do now is just go in straight with the tinting white, and it's going to go down to about there. Put the tinting white in, bringing it up to the trees, and running some of that tinting white up into the blue, and I start to get the colour that I want. I'd like it maybe to be a little... no, actually I'm quite pleased with that. I'm going to put a little bit of the pure tinting white down in here. And later on that area might get a little glaze to make it slightly warmer, but we'll see. Put some of that a little bit thicker on top there. And you can see all my strokes are going horizontally there. Just, I want a nice, smooth, clear sky. And I can work back into that sky later if I want to. It doesn't always have to be ala prima. I'll probably go back and when it's a little bit drier with some clouds there. What I want to do now is bring a little bit of that colour, the sky, down into the water there. So just going in with some of the blue, a little bit of the tinting white, and making that little sky reflection part there. It's a little bit too dark, it's a little bit more light to work that in. And now I'm pulling the strokes down vertically because reflections go vertically. I'm pulling it down a little bit here too because in the image there's some sky colour reflected there around the rocks, and you can see as I pull it down it's catching a bit on that texture gel that I put in, the modelling paste. That's okay because I can go back in with the colour that I really want over the top of that. Now the rest of this is going to get some very warm colour. I'm going to go in with a little bit of the transparent red. This is where, because you're glazing, you can put in a little bit of glazing gel, which is this one, liquid glazing gel. It's a gloss, low viscosity medium, and it's made by Atelier, especially for interactive acrylic paints, but you can use it with ordinary acrylic paints as well. And here I'm just brushing it in across the riverbed. It can go into a bit of that blue, I don't mind that. That's the bottom of the foliage there, and there's a whole lot of shadow on the water there, which is going to be much darker. So first I'm getting in this layered base of, oh, I've put it on my rock, but it doesn't matter because I can go over that later. Just really want to go around the rock though. A little bit more of the red, a little bit more of the glazing liquid, and you can go sort of 50-50, up to 50-50 with that. I don't really always do that much of a dilution with the gel, but you can and still retain the colour of your paint. Because it's a clear gel, it just gives it a more spreadable consistency, which is nice for glazing, thins it out. Up through here it's going to be much darker, so what I'm going to do is add in a little bit of that burnt umber and a touch more of the glazing gel. I try and keep one side of my glazing gel warm and one cool. And I'm going to put in a touch of dark sand purple there as well, and that's going to be the very dark shadowed area which I'm just popping in there. It really needs to let that bottom glaze settle before I do that. But it's just to give me a little idea of where that's going to go. So while that's settling a bit, I'm going to start some work on the foliage. There's a little bit of landscape back there, so I'm going to pop that in, just using a little bit of yellow ochre for the landscape. There's one colour I didn't put out, which I always like to have on there, and that's Naples yellow. So I'll grab my big tub of Naples yellow. It's a really nice mixing colour and tinting colour. So I want back there to be warm, sort of grass, just a tiny touch of bluey green in it. That's going to go just across here, and it's just a hint of it coming down towards the river there. And there'll be some distant trees there. Now I'm going to get into the rest of the trees there. I'm going to take, oops, a more rounded brush there. You can see that it's got a rounder edge, and so it gives a more natural shape for the trees. I'm going to mix up some tree colours now. So there won't be any green in this. I'm going to use some combinations of blues and yellow. So I've got a yellow ochre coming into this one, into ultramarine blue to make that blue.
Then I'm going to take a little bit of ultramarine blue and some of the light cadmium yellow, and you'll be able to see that they're entirely different greens. That's a warmer green, this is a cooler green and a brighter green. And I can go again with some of the ultramarine and some of the cadmium yellow medium. Mix myself up a batch of that. And to make variation to that, I can add a little bit more of the blue to that one. And using that palette knife, I've created several different greens there. And then for this one, I'm just going to add in a bit more of the light. Pop that over to the side there. So I've got a number of different greens there. And I can add in a little bit more of the yellow ochre to this one to have a few different greens there. So these are more my shadowy greens, and these are the brighter highlight greens. So I'm going to pop in some of the shadowy areas, which are around here. You can see I'm just dabbing it on and still letting some of that orangey underpainting show through. So some of the shadows are a little bit deeper than others. And then there are trees that are this sort of colour as well, not such a bright green, they're more of an ochre-y green. Going around the corners with that. Then over on the other side, just putting in a few little shadows down here. You can see because that sky's still wet, it's mixing in with those tree colours, which I don't mind at this stage because I can darken them up if I want to later. It gives a nice softer look for the background trees. So I'm just putting in the background trees, and because the sky's still wet, it mixes in and makes some nice soft blue, more appropriate for the background. And I'll liven those up a bit later on. So that's just getting in a bit of the shadow area. There's more shadow area on this side than there is on this side. Now I'm going to go in with some of the greener, brighter colours. Just start with some of the darker ones. Pop them around. You can see it's an entirely different green there. It's just random patting on, and some of that texture from below is showing through as I start to do this now. And that's the moulding gel that I used. And I'm randomly putting this on at the moment just to create some different greens, a little bit of texture on there. And I can come back later on and work out anything else I want to do to vary those colours, to make different sort of foliage decisions. At the moment it's just patting it on, getting some sort of foliage started. You can try using different brushes. If I put that brush aside and take a little squarer brush, I can get more individual pats on there if that's what I'm after. Or I can just drag it over the top of some of that texture paste that I put in earlier to create a little bit of foliage with the texture, and let some of that underpainting show through to warm up that area a bit. So try some of your different brushes and see what happens when you use different ones, how that affects the shape of the leaves and the look of your trees. They will need more layers of interest in there. This is just setting down the bones of it. And as I mix some of that green, the lighter greens into the shadowed greens, I get a more natural transition between them. So you can still do that while they're wet and add a little bit of it in some few other spots. And the shore is coming down to somewhere around about there, and I want to have a little bit of darkness there, so I'm putting in some of that blue, tiny bit of purple, and making a little undershadowed area there where the trees are going to come down. I'm just going to strengthen up some of this with some of the purple and a little bit of the ultramarine blue, just to strengthen some of the shadows in there. Again, I'm just using now my little square brush to tap it in. It just gives a little bit of a different look to the trees. You don't want all the foliage to be the same. Working a little bit of shadow in up here and up through here. Just randomly placing the shadow. I'm looking back at the patterns in here, but I'm also just trying to make some pleasing patterns myself. So think about where you want the light and dark contrast to be, and you can vary those shadows as much as you like. Now the shadow's coming quite dark underneath here, so I'm really hitting it now with a big splodge of the dioxine and that ultramarine blue, and popping those shadows right in underneath there to create a really shadowed area. Pulling some of those shadows out into the river as well. And once those glazes are dry, I'll come back in again and just making a little bit of a dark edge around the bank there and pulling that down into the river as well. So you can start to see some of the variation in there. Around here I want to get in a few little bits of shadow as well. So this will be the edge of this foreground tree here, and I'm just putting a little bit of shadow in behind it to help delineate it a bit. And adding some little bits of shadow up through there. I've done, now we can see that that is beginning to look like the reference there. I've got all this foreground of little rocks to work on now, and I'm going to use a small round brush. I'm just going to dab in some of the colours now. The colours are warm and cool, so there are some warm coloured rocks and these greyer rocks which are more blue underneath. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of a grey, which is a toning grey, and you can use that to mix in with some of your, I'm just going to put it over this side. This is where I tend to keep all my toning and mixing mediums. So I can use a little bit of that grey to soften off the blue I've used in the sky, and use some of that for the little rocks that are in here. And what I do is I just start dabbing around little suggestions of rocks that are going to be under the water. And I'm keeping them fairly flat under the water, because the water distorts them and makes them look less round than they would be on the ground. I'm just really making a little pattern here of lights and darks. This is going to be a fairly light rock, and at this stage all I'm doing is brushing over some of that bluey grey, which is actually going to end up a lot lighter on top of the water because it becomes darker under the water, and under the water will be the wet areas of the rock and they will be darker. So just dotting in really just a pleasing pattern of lights to help lead the eye in. Add more in as you need it. As you get closer down here, some of the rocks will be slightly larger than the ones back here. So the closer you come, the more you see of the actual shapes of the rocks, so they can be more rounded and not quite so flat. Here I'm just scooting over a little bit of, over that texture medium, a little bit of the greys, coming down into the water for the wet part of the rock there, which tends to smooth out and doesn't have as much texture. You don't see as much texture as you do above the surface. That will end up being a lot lighter. So what I'm going to do is actually take some of that grey and mix it with a little bit of yellow and a bit of the toning white. I think it's going to end up still being too dark. So I'm just going to scrape that over for now, and then I'm going to come back later on with even lighter colours. That'll just set a base kind of colour for the rock. And where it goes underwater, it's going to get warmed up slightly by the water underneath it. So I'm just putting a little bit of that glazing warm I put in. So they're the three main rocks, and they're going to get some cools and lights put on them, but right now I'm just going to mix up some more colours to go, greying it off a little bit again. So I've got a warm grey now, and you could of course mix that without using the toning grey if you wish to. I'm just making little dabs here all through the river now, just tiny little ones back here, almost like a pontillist painting. That's going to end up with a whole lot more glazing over the top, but right now all it needs is a few little dots and dashes, and down here a lot more dots and dashes of different warm and cool colours. Again, as we come forward, start making some of those dots and dashes a little bit bigger, a little bit rounder, but remember the bottoms are going to be flat because they're sitting on the riverbed. You're going to see all these rocks all the way through here, so it takes a little bit of time at this point to make the believable riverbed. Going back in with a different earth colour now, just so I've got lots of variation in those rocks. Some of the rocks will overlap, some will be bigger, some will be smaller. Don't forget to carry it on up here into this area. And it's easy to change them if you make any mistakes or don't like the way you've popped them in. You can just put a little brush through while it's really wet, and that will move them and shift them and give them a bit of a look of the water blurring them a bit, because the rocks below the water will not have the same clarity as the rocks above. You know that yourself from when you're looking down at a river or the pebbles at a beach, but above the water they're much more clear. So here I'm putting a few darker ones in, taking a chance to darken up the edges of the submerged rocks and warm them a bit, because as I said, the water flowing over them gives them a warmer look than above the surface as well. I can put in a red one if I want to, more red coloured rocks. This is a transparent red oxide, and that just gives you a bit more variety in the riverbed. Over here it's quite red because it's the tannins in the water that leach in from the bracken and other vegetation. So it's going to be very dark and warm over here. So I can start putting in some of the rocks in a much darker colour here. And then I'll be glazing over them. And you can see as I pull them with the brush, they get a more blurred look and they get a flatter base area. So that's quite a good way to do it too. And you can go in with another colour underneath some of the other ones, lighter ones you've done, and just give them a little pull, which helps to suggest running water over. It's easy to get bored at this stage with all those dots and dashes, and you can tend to get to take a little bit of a faster approach and do a few more. If you're like me and you like to paint quickly, try doing a few of these sort of strokes across the bed and then going back in over the top of them with a few more defined strokes. So that's another way of creating the bed of the river. So here I'm giving it a lot more looser. I'm doing them horizontally, and they're obscuring and then bringing back in some of the little dots I did underneath. They're going to show through in some places and not in the other. So I can then go back in with some more dots over the top of that. Keep filling in that area till I'm happy with it. It's quite dark around here, so I'm actually getting some of that burnt umber and putting in some really dark stones and pebbles in some spots, just to counterpoint all the lighter ones. All the time I'm trying to look at the patterns that I'm making with the lights and the darks, and you can see I'm making a kind of ziggy-zaggy pattern so that it does keep taking you up the river there. I'm going to actually at the same time brush in a little bit of this over here. I'm going to change brushes and just go for a bit of a bigger brush. A bit larger flat brush there, just to brush in a little bit more of that burnt umber. I'm going to pull a little bit of it down too to suggest that some of that's reflections. Some shadows, some's reflections. And the reflections will always come vertically down into the water. At that stage I'm also going to add in a little bit of the greens from the trees as reflections along there. There's not much of the green from the trees because that tannin colour comes right in there and stops the greens, turns them into an already brown. Flattening out a few of those bases there and just using a little bit of that burnt umber to give some little kind of shadowy bits to the underside of some of those lighter rocks. You see a lot of the canvas texture, which you can also use as part of your rocky riverbed as well. So I've got a lot of little rocks in there. I haven't totally covered with rocks, but there'll be a lot of glazing going on over that, so that will help. Over here I need these rocks to go in though. I'm going to go back with that flat brush and use some of my pastel colours here. So they're really great for this lighter area. So I'm going to use the pastel colours. Let's move everything across a bit so that you can see I've got my brighter colours there, pastel colours here. I'm going to use some of the blues and violets to work in over this rocky area here. You can see how it picks up all that texture gel I used earlier. It leaves a little bit of that warmth coming through as well. I've got a little bit of a lemon yellow, so we can have some of the rocks with little bits of light coming on them. And I'm just going to work that, picking up different pastels with my brush and not mixing them on the palette, just letting them mix on the rocky area. And that texture paste has done a lot of the work for me there, creating the idea of rocks, small rocks there. Going right up to the bushes there, pulling them out there. There's a little patch of it further up too, a little sunlit patch back here. So this is all pebbles and rocks around the edge, so I'm popping those in. It fizzes around there. You can see the direction the river's taking. It's a nice wide bend of pebbles up there, so it's putting in a whole wide bend of pebbles and adding in a few more highlights down here. The lemon has a nice sunlit quality about it, and we can just pop that on over the top of some of those rocks. And go back around the corner there with a more greyed off colour as it goes in amongst the shadows. So there we have it. I've put in those rocks very quickly there. I'm going to use some of these pastel colours to help with these rocks here to make them a little bit lighter on the top. I'm using some of the pastel lemon, very light shade of yellow. That's giving them a sunlit look and keeping them nice and light. I can also add in a little bit of a mauvey pinky colour if I like, which is lighter than the grey that I used, and a little bit of contrast for the yellow. Of course you can mix these. If you don't have a set of pastel acrylics, you can mix these up on your palette yourself from your other primary colours and a tinting white. It's just very easy to use the pre-made ones, and I do like them. I can also, if I want a few very light rocks over here, hit the top of them. They might be just poking through the water, and I could do this later on once I put the glazes in, but I'm just showing you now. Okay. What I'm going to do while I'm waiting for all this area to dry is just go back in here and re-establish that, because I've lost a bit of the distant field there. So I'm just going to re-put that in. Add a little bit of green to it as well. And that's the distant riverbank. I'll put in a couple of darker trees or shrubs coming down to the river's edge there. Touch of yellow ochre with that Naples yellow, and that's the field back there. Now our job is just to be patient, which is a very hard thing for me to do, so I'm going to leave that to dry a little bit and we'll come back to it shortly. Well, we're starting off quite well. We've got trees here, the sky, a little bit of distant background, some textured rocks here and some larger rocks, and then the little rocks that are going to be underneath the surface. And now what we're going to do is do a little bit of glazing. So for glazing, I'm going to be using the gloss liquid medium and some of these colours up here. I'm going to start off with a nice warm, just getting my brush wet, but I don't really want lots of water on it, so I'm going to mop it off. Take a little bit of the yellow ochre and some glazing medium and just make it a nice thin mixture. And I'll also be putting some of this transparent red oxide there with some of the glazing mixture. So I'm going to start off with the red oxide and just pull it a little bit there too, but we'll have some greenery coming down there. That's going to be a little bit of greenery, but I'm going to give it a bit of a glaze first. So just pulling this colour, add a little bit more of the glazing medium. If you don't have a glazing medium and you want to try this, just use water to thin your paint down and put on thin layers of the acrylic paint, thin down with water. It won't be as glossy as this because this is a gloss medium, but it will give you some nice transparent layers that you can work with. And by adding a few different layers, you can add a nice sense of depth and wetness to your painting. So I'm going over the submerged bits of rock with this glazing medium to show that they're underwater. Going around that, and I will be putting some more some more colour and paint onto those rocks again later on. But right now it's just glaze all the way around, and then of course we have to wait again for that glaze to dry in that area. But while that's happening, I can do a little bit more work on the trees. So just cleaning off the brush, and I'll leave it stacked there, and I'm going to go back into these trees again and create some more interest in them. I'm going to use my little flat and just mix up a little bit more of the greens. This time I want to make them a little bit more earthy, so it'll be the yellow ochre going in there. And then just working in some different sorts of trees amongst the other trees I've got in there. So they've got a few different greens. Make that one through here this colour. I can just go in with some neat yellow ochre if I want to. You don't always have to mix onto the palette. It's kind of fun to do it on your canvas surface as well. So there's my neat yellow ochre, and then I'm going back in just with a bit of neat ultramarine blue and working that in for the shadowed areas. So just getting some versatility and variety in those trees there. There's quite a lot of the orange showing through. If I don't want quite that much, I just go back in, mix up a little bit more. This time I'm going to take some of the cerulean blue, and that makes an entirely different green. And I'll pop in with that green and just add some, it's a much bluer green. The other one was a more yellowy green. And just pull that over a few spots. I don't want to lose all of the orange, but I just want to have it, as I said, a few different greens in there. So much cooler kind of bluey green. And I don't really want to keep that, but I'm going to put it on first, and then I'm going to work back over it with some of the yellow ochre kind of colours. The yellow ochres will blend with the bluey green and still create a green, but give it a little bit more warmth. I just felt that was a little bit too cold. Cool. And what I'm after is just a whole lot of different greens there in the foliage. I'm getting some nice little leafy bits out there as well. That's warmed it up a bit and made it not quite so cool. Then I'm going to take just a couple of little lime trees out there. And just work that bank again a little bit. Okay. So that's done a little bit more in the trees. They need to have a small few branches in there too, and trunks. I've got a very fine rigger brush here. I'm just going to wet it a little bit and then dip it in this light sort of colour and just pull up a couple of suggestions of tree trunks going up through there. Not too many. Just enough to add a few verticals and keep it interesting. Taking a small brush, I'm going to go in with some very bright green now. And that's in this little area here where I'm going to have the Montbreches, and they have very long, skinny kind of leaves. So I'm putting those in. Let some of them come out over the shadows. There'll be a few of them over in this section as well. And maybe a few just poking their heads up here. They're prevalent in New Zealand as you drive through in summer. Make a beautiful splash of orange all through the countryside. And to put those in, I'm just using the little fine rigger again and some dots of orange. They just grow on a little stem, quite high, and they come down all the way down. That stem, either side, and a nice thin line. So pop a few more over here. Just tiny little blobs. Of pure orange. If I want to a little variety, I just dip my rigger in the Cad yellow medium and pop a few little spots of that in there as well to break up the orange into some different shades. A few suggestions of them back here. I don't want them too level there, so what I'm tending to do is to make this lot a little bit higher. Maybe bring the foliage up a little bit more. You can see how that bright spot of yellow really helps vary it out a little bit, so I'm going to put a few more little spots of that yellow in. And then a little bit through those ones. And that's a really nice touch there. You can also add a little bit of that, tiny touch of that on some of the leaves as well. And then I'm putting a little bit of cooler greens in the leaves as well for a bit of shadowed area. Back to the brighters. Okay. So that's the little splash of colour in there. Still a little bit wet, so what I'll do while I'm waiting for that is go back into these rocks there. They're all pretty much the same colour. Just clean my brush off. And try and make it a little bit more varied. So I'm going back in with that lemon to give it a really light colour there and pull it back over the rest of that rock. And it's still catching where the ridges were made with that moulding paste, and that's what you want. Then I can go back in with a bit of the bluer colour back here. Just wiping that up with my rag. That's going to dry down here, but while I'm up there I could pop in a bit of vegetation shadows just down there. Won't be reflecting exactly what you can see up there because of the way reflections occur, so you don't have to be too precise. I want the general shape, but the colours can be a little bit different. Add a little bit of the warmer yellows in there. While I'm at it, I want to put a little bit more of the lighter white into the clouds there. So I'm just going into this tinting white. And adding a little bit of that in. And then I can add a little bit of that down into the water here as well. That just helps to pull the eye out that way. I think maybe that's could go in a little bit there too. Just break that up. It was a little bit too triangular. Okay, and there we have the clouds, the reflections, and maybe these rocks need to come out a little bit more, and that's easily done. I'm just going to put a few little dabs of rock out there, and you can add those in now, you can add them in later. And these little dabbies can go over the top of some of that texture that you've already got there as well. We might save the rest of them for later. So I just want that to dry off a bit now. So that layer's dry. Now we're going to glaze on again. Just taking some of the glazing medium. And I'm trying to get a greeny, over here it's a more tanniny colour, here it's a greeny colour. So what I'm going to do now is just glaze on a little bit of a blue. And that goes straight over that. And I'm just working the colours to get the suggestion of the river there. If you add white to your mix like I have here, it's going to be a little bit more opaque. You can see that some of the areas are opaque. I don't mind that because the river isn't perfectly clear. So I'm just putting that layer on. A little bit of it around the edges. And then that one needs to dry a little bit. While it's drying, I'm going to make the underwater part of the rocks a little bit more well defined. I think I'll use a smaller brush there. Use this one, and I'm going to take some of the blue, this bluey grey colour, which is darker than the rocks, and I'm going to run it around the rock under the water to give that illusion of this part of the rock being darker and underwater. And the same with this, otherwise it doesn't really look real. So this darker part of the rock is underwater. Back into it with another glaze. And this time I'm going to be doing another earth colour there. And earth colours are not as transparent and translucent as say the cadmiums or the naphthals. But I do want to build up some layers. It doesn't all have to be totally transparent, because in the water are sediments, and they're going to be carried down in the water and going to help to create a little bit of a blurring of what's underneath as you look through the sediments into the water. So now I'm just picking up whatever's there on the palette. I'll make a little bit more of this with a bit more of the glazing medium and just finish off down the bottom. And again, that one will need to dry, and then I want to start getting some of the green and other colours that are in the water in there as well. So while that's drying, I'm just going to mix up a little bit of a green here. So it's going to take a touch of the ultramarine, but only a tiny bit of it. And I'll just try that out around the corner. So some of that's going to go in next once that's dry. You can see how we're starting to build up a rich layered on colour in there. I will be going back and bringing some of those rocks back into it once I've finished getting the glazes on. I'm picking up a little bit of that leaf green as I go as well to just vary it out a bit. In here it's quite a bit darker, and what I'm doing there is taking a tiny bit of the purple dark scene, and I'm going to run a little bit of that there. It's a little bit more opaque, covers a little bit more of the rocks behind it, and I'm running a little bit of that in a few places, but not all over as I've done all the other glazes, and it's just going to mingle with that other green glaze that I've put on. So just to create a little pattern of darks going up through here, back through there, to help lead it in. I'm going to make all this quite dark out here. So I'm putting a lot of that glaze in that corner to try and keep the eye out of travelling out of there. And I'm going to mix up a little bit of that blue as well in with it, and pop a little bit of that glaze coming down through there. I want to keep the interest moving up into the picture rather than moving out of it. It's very dark in here, and I'll darken that up later. So right now we've got the glazes going on. Darken that right up. Put a touch more blue down there. So I'm just scraping up a bit of that sky sort of blue, and run a few little dots of it here and there over the water. And that can go in again once it's dry. I'm going to slip a few of those dots of the lighter stones in now, dotting out into the water. I don't want them to be too big. I'm just putting them in with the tone in grey, and then I'll add some colours on top once I'm happy with them. So just so that there's a few coming out from the water around where the little pebbly beach is. And I'll put the occasional one down this way as well, peeping out of the water. And they're all aimed at showing that there's water running and there's rocks both under the water and above the water. Also trying to get in a pleasing pattern to help take the eye. Through the painting. A few lighter stones popping up through there, which will need a little bit of the toning white in them too. Because I don't want them just grey, and they'll show up better against that sky if there's got a little bit of white in them. And this is a sort of pearlescent almost white, so it's not a straight white, which would be too bright. It just needs a little bit of variety in the colours, as with everything else. And just touching up these rocks as well with some of that pearlescent white. Now's the time for me to review how I'm going with the river, and I want a little bit more of greenness in it. So I'm just going back in, and I'm taking this very green and just giving it a little bit of a glaze over a couple of spots. Just to make some of the area a little bit greener. And I'm going to add in a few little more rocks. Just going dipping straight into here and adding in a few more rocks to the bottom of the water. A few little grey ones. Some darker ones. Just thought there weren't quite enough in there. Some darker bluer grey ones rather than the yellowy ones. I'm just taking some of those colours that I had previously mixed for other areas and using them. I'm also taking the opportunity to pop a little bit of darker colour under some of the rocks for a little bit of shadow underneath them. I'm putting that in a few places throughout the I'm just putting a few bits of a few dark lines and areas of some underwater rocks. I could have put these in at the beginning, but you can put them in at any time with acrylics because you can just then reglaze over them. So I'm making some darker areas down here in the corners where I don't want it to go out of the eye to be going out, so I'm just darkening off the base of the water with a few more rocks. This is the burnt umber that I'm using. I'm just giving it a little swish around. With the brush. Let it making random marks basically. Don't like those blue ones so much, so they're getting a bit of the burnt umber treatment. Adding a little bit of it around the edges. Of the rocks there. And I'll also add in a little bit of the raw sienna as well, just to give it a little bit of the watery kind of colour around the edges of the rocks. You could keep doing this for a very long time. Just making a little patchwork of rocks. It just depends how far you want to push it, because a lot of those rocks are going to be imagined. What I'm going to finish off with is a very pale blue wash, which will react with the yellows underneath there and the ochres to give a nice greeny bluey tinge to the water. So once I've put all this in, it has to dry before I can do that. Although I can put it over and just add a bit more smudginess to the rocks underneath. That little rock there I'm going to actually make above water, because I've put so much texture on it, it's not working as an underwater rock. So you can keep going back into these areas and changing them a bit. So that's all going to be above the ground, above the water. Just putting a little bit of warmth on those above the water rocks as well. Okay. Putting in a few more little above the water rocks here. I've lost my little branches there, so I'm going to go back in again with a bit thicker paint and put in some of those branches. They're too big, but I'll work those down a little bit in a minute. Here we go back in with the branches over here in the trees. That one is way too thick, so I'm just going to take a brush, mix up a little bit more of a green there and work back into that, so I can cover it up a bit. So yeah, if you're not making mistakes you can't fix. Okay, taking a little bit of the yellow here, well, I'm not using that brush because I've got it too green, so just dipping it into the pale lemon and making some little sun-kissed tops of the rocks there on the shore. even coming out into the water a little bit, they're going to get a little bit of a touch up. Just get the warmth of the sun on them. You can see I've been going back and forth into these rocks as I've been working my way around the painting, just adding and subtracting and adding again till I'm happy. And that little bit of pastel lemon just helps these rocks in amongst the reflections of the sky to show up a little bit better too. And here at the edge, just helping the rocks to show up. Now I can go in with my other colours as well. There's a sort of light grey mauvey colour. Just dab that over the texture I put on earlier to create some individual rocks amongst all that texture. Down here I'm doing the same, just a few dabs. Now a little bit of a pinky mauve. And just dabbing it on. There's a little bit more of those rocks up here. I'm just adding in some rocks there. So that's pretty nice on the rocks. Now I have to just go back into here and finish off. So it'll be a little bit of a clean up of that brush. I want a bit more of the glazing medium because I've used it all up. So here comes in a little dab of that glazing medium again. I'm just going to wipe this area off. I've got a lot of light in there, a lot of white and greys from the mixing, and I don't want that for this. What I want to do is just take a little bit of that cobalt blue and a whole lot of the liquid glazing. Mix myself up a little batch of that. And then I want to add a little bit of that in. Not everywhere. Just in parts to add some extra sort of sky colour in there. It gives a little bit of a deeper colour to the water. Take some of those rocks I put above the water back down under the water. That's fine. Mixes with some of the yellow ochres that are still. And that gives me more variation in the water, which is what I was after. I need to just go around those rock edges a little bit. They've missed some of this glazing. So I'm glazing right up to it, and I can go back in again with the... Okay. So I'm fairly happy with the water now. It's got suggestions of runs in the water, just where those little bits of the lemon yellow have mixed with the blue. I can put more structured marks in if I want to, but I'm not really sure that I need it. What I need to do here is really make this much deeper and darker underneath there and down through here. So I'm going to go back into ultramarine blue, a touch of dioxazine purple. That is a very rich mix, so I'm going to tone it down a little bit with a touch of transparent red. And that is going here in the shadowed area. Building a bit of shadow around there. I'm actually going to add a little bit of it in here, not a huge amount. Just a little bit in behind those red flowers. I'm pulling it down into the water around this area here. And so I'm taking it up into the textured area of foliage. I did pull that down into the water. Then I want to add a little bit of green in there as well to help it settle back in. Let some of the other foliage, greener foliage, come through in the reflections. Tone that down. I put too much in there, so I just tone it back down a little bit there. Add some little bits of shadows up in there. Take my little brush and just add a little bit of darks around the back of the orange for it to sort of show through. Make those darks a little bit more pronounced around here, and throw a little bit of a shadow out onto the rocks there with a little mix of the sky blue and that purpley mix. So I'm just going to throw out some little bits of shadow. And you can see where the shadows catch on the rocky texture there too. It helps to make more believable shadows. There'll be a little bit more of that shadow coming through up there. Might even add a slight bit of that shadow to these rocks in the water. And a little bit of the darkness under the water. Take some of this and give some tiny little marks in the water, just suggesting again the shadows underneath some of these rocks, because it's quite flat underneath the rocks. They're sitting on a riverbed, flat bed. Up here, I'll just put one or two small rocks. Small rocky shapes that can reflect down into the water to again suggest the edge. Of the river. Quite nice putting a bit of this purple behind those very bright flowers too, and in amongst them just show a bit how their leaves work. I'm going to call that done. All I need to do is sign it off, and you know what I'm going to sign it in? That little orange, just to bring a bit of this down into this area, and I'm going to sign it off in this corner. That rock's kind of keeping it flowing out of there, and so I want to stop it coming out of here, so it's going to be a little orange signature. I keep the brush fairly wet and the paint fairly loose for the signature, because we don't want it to get it needs to look as easy as the painting looks, your signature. I hope you enjoyed that demonstration, which was all about how to create that look in a river of rocks being underwater, rocks being above water, and to get that nice S shape going back into the distance, which is so helpful in a composition. Also, the joy of adding in a little bit of unexpected colour and then match it with your signature just to tie and harmonise it together. There was a lot of glazing going on in this. We used a bit of the texture, the light moulding paste for the texture in the rocks, and it was kind of a fun painting to do. Hope you enjoyed that. We'll have more later in the month, another lesson on rocks in acrylic, and I think the next lesson we're going to take it in a little bit and have a look at acrylics in more detail, how to create that wet look on rocks. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time in the studio. Bye for now.